I'm going to introduce my panel in a moment, and it is, as Jamie said, a terrific panel. But let me take a moment and just talk for a second about this topic and how we want to have this discussion. And I think we're really going to do this as a discussion where it's just the right size. And it's, Paul was commenting, what great thing about Aspen is unlike virtually anything else I'm involved with where everyone sits in the back, here people seem to want to be part of the conversation, which is terrific. And we're going to make that happen. So we'll start with a few questions for the panelists, but I'm going to pretty quickly move out to you as the audience and get questions. So be thinking about what you want to say. You will be on film. So I'm going to ask you also to stand up and introduce yourself and where you're from, and then direct your question to the audience. So Jamie made a joke. We did play a little around with, we had originally, I think, a quite boring name for this panel. Gillian helped us reframe it around making America's economy great again. Arguably one of the defining issues for us in the US and by extension I think in the world. 2 seconds of context on that. Growth is a pretty simple equation if you get rid of all the complexity, which is it comes down to the productivity of the people in your country and the labor supply of those people. That is, more productive, more labor equals more growth. For the US, that was a fabulous equation for more or less our entire history, but certainly our post-war history. Because we had increasing productivity and we had an increasing labor supply as women came into the labor force and we had the post-war boom in people. Over the last 15, 20 years, maybe even a little longer, that equation's changed. Productivity growth has basically stalled and maybe even in the last year or so dipped towards negative, and our labor supply has essentially peaked and seems to be starting to flatten. And so what we're seeing here in the US is a shift from what was roughly 3.2% growth to something like 2 to 2.5% growth. That is a meaningful difference. It sounds like low numbers, but a meaningful difference in what will happen to our standard of living if we can't change that equation. And our current president came into office on a mix of different topics, not least of which, though, was this question of how do we get growth back into the threes again. The good news is by the end of the session, our panelists will have given us the answer, and then we can convey it directly to the president. So let me introduce, to my left, we have Gillian Tett, who is the managing editor for the Financial Times in the United States, author of many books. A number of you in the audience may have been written about by Gillian. Certainly she writes about the topics of our time. Paul Singer, to her left, is the founder of Elliott Management Corporation, which is an investment firm that he actually founded back in the 70s, so it's been in operation for a long time. Probably of equal import for us, though, Paul is also the founder of the Paul E. Singer Foundation, which is focused, amongst other things, on making sure our democracy in the United States stays vibrant. David Cohen, to Paul's left, is a senior vice president at Comcast Corporation. He has a mix of different duties there, including being counselor to the CEO and the head of diversity for Comcast. But again, I think for our purposes, David has been in some ways, a model American citizen. He's been involved at the city level in Philadelphia, at the state level in Pennsylvania, and at the national level in terms of trying to influence, in the most positive sense, the future of our country. So great people, great topic. Let's get started. Gillian, I may start with you. I framed this growth paradox or this growth issue. I'd be interested in your thoughts on some of what structurally or emotionally seems to be happening in the United States that is driving this lower growth that we're seeing. Well,
I think, first of all, thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be on this panel discussing such an important issue. I think the thing everyone in the room needs to realize is that there are some very, very profound mysteries hanging over the US economy today in terms of what's happening and in terms of, in particular, what's not happening. I mean, I draw a parallel sometimes with Janet Yellen and the pilot of a plane who's flying along and then suddenly realizes that the altimeter doesn't seem to be quite working and some of the other controls are going haywire, and she pulls on a lever and the rudder doesn't move. And that's very roughly what's actually happening in the US economy today, because what's happening with productivity is a complete mystery. I mean, if you talk to central bank governors in private, they will admit that very, very frankly, because all the data suggests that productivity has completely collapsed in a rather peculiar way in the last few years. And yet, most of us live lives where we have more and more technological apps and gizmos and gadgets which appear to be making our lives more and more productive. The fact that wages are not rising, even though unemployment has come down a long way, is another mystery. The fact that inflation is so low is yet another mystery. And perhaps the biggest mystery of all is that the Federal Reserve has been trying for the last 18 months to tighten monetary conditions, to raise the cost of borrowing in the markets, and yet even though it's raised policy rates, the cost of borrowing has not been tightening to the degree that it expected. So there are a lot of things going on that just don't quite make sense. That's the first point. The second point is that the American economy right now is in the 6th, 7th, 8th year of a recovery. Historically, recoveries only normally last 6 years. A recession is frankly overdue, if you believe the charts. And yet we have a president who's come in and appears to be committed to reflation. So the question of what's going to happen over the next year or two is very uncertain. But the bigger issue really is what on earth is happening with productivity, and why are all the numbers suggesting that somehow America as a whole has become a lot less productive. And I'll just say the really important thing to understand about productivity is that there's really been 3 phases in the last 50 years. Post-war through to really the late 1980s, 90s, you saw really quite high levels of growth and productivity increases. That then slowed down to a striking degree. But in the last decade, there's really been a dramatic slump in productivity.
On that last topic, because I think, as I mentioned in my opening, that has been, I think, in many ways one of the great mysteries. Some of which we wonder is actually a measurement question, right? Are we actually measuring productivity correctly?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues, and I was actually around a table with central bankers the other day talking about this. I mean, this may be simply because the statisticians just don't know how to count things anymore. The whole way we do our national accounts was set up really to count post-war industrial growth. So it's very good at measuring widgets and counting cars. It's terrible at actually measuring what comes out of your cell phone. And if you think for a moment about how you might use Google for free, seemingly, and because it's for free, it's not counted in the statistics, and in exchange you hand over data to Google for free, that kind of transaction doesn't appear any in the statistics, yet it's very, very important. So it may be measurement. It may be that the financial crisis messed up all these statistics completely, and so no one actually knows what's really happening on a historical basis. It may be because basically people have run out of good ideas and there simply isn't as much innovation. Or it may be just a time lag effect, that all the brilliant inventions haven't yet fed through. Or it could be yet another manifestation of this terrible problem of bifurcation that America has between not just rich and poor, educated and uneducated, but between a hyper-efficient and productive small group of companies that are seizing all the productivity gains and a big, long tail of other institutions and companies, including in the government sector, that actually are still stuck in the dark ages.
Let me use that last point as a jumping off point. Paul, you and I have talked a little bit about this question of what needs to happen in U.S. government in order to unblock some of the log jams around productivity and around growth in the country. You want to share some of your thoughts on that?
Yes. Gary, first let me preface this by saying you promised the answers, and I would just like to say the answers cost extra, Gary.
I tell my clients that too.
But I'm happy. You get them very cheaply from the Financial Times, so there you go, by comparison.
I run a hedge fund.
Yeah.
I'd like to provide a little more context. I agree with everything that Gillian said in the way of context and background. Let's go back to the period in the, I suppose, 70s when, and I'm not sure that it began there, but an ever-growing list of products and services were able to be generated around the world in emerging countries, other countries, at far lower labor costs and then overall costs, and ultimately of equal or higher quality than in the United States. The United States, it would be unfair to say that it had a difficult time dealing with it. I believe that American policymakers basically ignored this thing, kept up prices, erected barriers, and tried to protect. But over a period of time, this issue was eating away at the living standard, or the prospect of a living standard, of the American worker. At the same time, America, along with all of its developed country peers and neighbors, became hopelessly insolvent. Generation after generation of politicians, left and right, more and more promises. And so you had a kind of a stultification. In the 90s, that stultification was masked by the internet and tech boom. The internet was something that America and Americans and the American culture did very, very well, probably better than anywhere else. The French invented it somewhere in the 60s in a primitive way, and it never got beyond primitive. So it was masked by the dot-com and tech boom. That collapsed. But then the next masking was the period leading up to 2008, the structured products, really the leverage boom. Debt products, hidden debt, massive debt in the financial institutions and throughout the system. And so the structural problems, the structural reforms that were needed to deal with this imbalance between a $30 or $40 per hour salary and wage rate, 50, 60 after benefits, and $1 or 50 cents an hour in many other countries, able to generate amazingly sophisticated products and services. All of a sudden, the debt boom, the structured product boom, the leverage boom, the unsound financial system collapsed. And the problem post-collapse, which some people described as secular stagnation, is that throughout this last 8 years, 8+ years, the structural reforms, labor market reforms have not been made, and so secular stagnation was invented or elevated as the explanation. The developed world, America, can't, they say, grow more than 1.5 or 2 or 2.25%, much less in Europe, close to zero in Japan. And I strongly don't believe that. I believe that the financial crisis did not represent a line of demarcation between the America that could grow and the America that can't grow. I also don't think that tech is basically the destroyer of people's standard of living. First of all, tech as a destructive force is primarily a developed country phenomenon. In the emerging markets, this glorious, over the last 10, 20 years, increase in the middle class, this rising of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into what in the developed world would look like the working class and the middle class, has been driven by technological change in so many ways. In some ways, leapfrogging the stultification of the technological infrastructure of the developed world. So in the developed world, however, I would just say that for about 150 years, it's been said over and over that technology and inventions and the industrial age would destroy, this Malthusian notion, would destroy jobs, the standard of living, the economies of the world. And of course, generation after generation of technological change has not done that. It's destroyed some jobs, evolved other jobs. Later in the panel, we can talk about labor market fixes, but I think that I'm optimistic only in the sense that I think bad policy and inability or unwillingness to engage in structural reforms got us where we are today, with millions of people in America leaving the labor force and not even counted in the arithmetic to generate this deeply misleading 4.2 or 4.3% unemployment rate. And better policies are definitely, in my view, able to get us off this plateau onto a higher level of growth, possibly even somewhat higher than historical measures. But that may be pie in the sky, but I think there's a lot of improvement that's possible.
David, maybe go with Paul's last point, this question of, if you buy this argument, which I very much do, which is that the financial crisis just exposed a set of flaws in the system as opposed to causing a set of flaws in the system. Maybe take a moment and think about some of those, or share with us some of your thoughts on some of those structural or semi-structural things that are getting in our way.
Right. So first of all, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. And I also was struck by your comment about how there are going to be answers coming out of this. And speaking for myself, I, for one, sure don't know enough to give any answers. I think it's safe to say that Paul and Gillian have forgotten more about these issues than I ever knew. And I'm a captive of my past experience, and my whole life has been devoted to trying to find harshly practical, sometimes unrealistic solutions to problems. And I am struck in this discussion and listening to Gillian and Paul, and as you said, it's a great building off point as to the limited role of government in solving this problem. And that in fact, a lot of what Paul was just talking about has actually been created by government. So as a recovering lawyer, one of my lawyerly favorite sayings is that bad facts makes bad law. And I think for the past 10 years, we have pretty clearly had a set of very bad facts coming out of the economic downturn that have created some real problematic governmental interference in an economy and in a system that will do better without governmental interference and without governmental engagement. And I'm not saying the government has no role, by the way. I don't want to suggest that there isn't anything the government can do, but I'll just tick off a few structural issues that I think the government has helped to create, and that real economic growth is going to require the government backing off. So the regulatory environment, and we can talk more about any or none of these, regulatory environment, the corporate tax environment, the debt and the crushing burden of entitlements, which is not only a governmental problem, but that debt ultimately is driving up interest rates, and if it doesn't, there are other corrections, there are other artificial corrections that are being made to prevent that from happening. And we're not going to have 2.5%, 3% economic growth in this country unless people have enough courage to stand up and say that we're going to fix our entitlement problem in the United States, and that we are going to come to grips once and for all with the debt. You just can't do it. On the other hand, there is role for the government in coordinating, facilitating workforce programs and workforce training. And I personally believe, Gillian, in listening to you, I have no scholarly evidence for this, but I have practical on-the-street experience that one of the biggest problems with productivity gap is we have all this technology which should be enhancing productivity, and we have this vast population that is unemployed, much of which not showing up in our unemployment numbers because they're deemed to have left the system, who don't know how to use the technology. So there's no productivity gain for them from the technology, and overall they're being absent from the workforce and not being able to be in the workforce is dragging down productivity. And I do think there's a role for government to play in partnership with the private sector, the nonprofit community in that space. And of course, my other bias, as I said, I'm a victim of all of my biases. My other bias, working for a technology company and an internet service provider, is that I think being the allegedly most technologically advanced country in the world, being one of the richest countries in the world, and having more than a quarter of our population not having broadband in their homes is one of those statements that everyone should be embarrassed about every time that they say it. And I don't think you're going to enhance productivity in a 21st century economy driven by technology and technological innovation when a quarter of your population doesn't have basic digital literacy skills and doesn't have access to broadband in their homes. So it's my practical approach, viewed a lot by the biases of my experience and my career.
Gillian, I know you have some thoughts on this from our prior discussions.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when it comes to the issue about the role of government, I very much agree that there are areas where the government needs to get out of the way, and the government has been very unhelpful. I also think that there are areas where the government actually probably does need to get more proactive right now, and education is one of them. And just as a kind of experiment, I'd like to ask, who here in the room has a BA? Okay, all right, almost everyone, okay? Who paid more than $100,000 in today's prices to get their BA when they were at college?
Does my parents paying count?
Or all their parents? I'm serious, okay? Not a lot of you. And I think when you look back over the history of what happened to America over the last century, the GI Bill, the fact that a huge swathe of people came back from World War II and were suddenly catapulted into the middle classes by the fact that there was actually subsidies for higher education, is one of the really big things that was transformational in the 20th century, because you suddenly gave people access to education in a fairly equal way, in a way that's almost unimaginable today on a mass scale. And to my mind, one of the sickest things about America today is the fact that education access is so incredibly unequal, the fact that it's so fantastically expensive to actually get an education. I say that not just because I'm a mother of 2 children myself, but because I speak to a lot of young kids who want to have jobs. And the fact that when I talk to people who made it and helped to make America great in the 20th century, captains of industry, CEOs, senior politicians, accomplished lawyers, anything else, time and again, I found out that somewhere in their background, they actually got, by today's standards, a pretty cheap higher education somehow in the 20th century. So to my mind, one of the key questions is how on earth is America going to make education affordable? How are they going to deal with this incredible student debt burden or bubble, which is in some ways dragging not just on an entire generation, but creating all kinds of financial issues too? And right now, I'm not convinced that the market is going to be able to fix that as it currently stands. I think that's one area where actually there needs to be some form of proactive government action, ideally in cooperation with industry as well and the private sector. But that problem, what we can see today, is not just going to fix itself by magic.
Please stay with that thought.
I'm going to stay with that thought. I mean, so Gillian, I totally agree. And by the way, I think it's more than higher education.
Yeah.
I think the state of public education in America is another travesty, and there has to be a role of government in that because public education is still a governmental function and governmental responsibility. I just want to graft onto that, and it's no disagreement whatsoever, and that is the notion that for a healthy, and sometimes this is controversial, so I want to be careful the way I say this. I mean, I believe that every young person in America who wants to get a college education should be able to get an affordable college education and to be able to seek the employment that comes with that higher education degree. But there are millions of young Americans who don't necessarily want or need a college education, and one of our huge crises in America are in these so-called middle skills jobs, which are incredibly plentiful in the economy. And then when I referenced the skills mismatch in our economy, that is a place where there is more demand for talent than available talent, and that's not college educated talent necessarily. It might be community college educated, maybe technical school. I look at our own company. We have 159,000 employees. Half of our employees do not need a college education to have those jobs, but they need some basic middle skills jobs. And Gary and we were talking about this. So this week, pretty exciting announcement. I'll give kudos to Microsoft, the Markle Foundation, which has been, Markle's been all over this issue, and Microsoft just gave a $25 million plus grant to the Skillful Initiative under the auspices of the Markle Foundation right here in Colorado, which is focusing on work readiness, skills-based training for these middle skills jobs. And I do think, as I said, there are roles for the government here. I think in that whole education, workforce, skills training, there is a role for government in partnership with the private sector and the nonprofit community.
Paul, please.
A couple of additional thoughts on David's take on this. I agree with David's comments and with Gillian's comments. A liberal arts education is one of the bulwarks of American culture and American growth. The notion of this millions and millions of kids getting educated at this age, 18 to 22, coming out with some basic understanding, has a tremendous amount of value. It so happens that in the past, that production and that particular kind of education, with the choices that in the 60s and later became increasingly untethered. You know, you could come out of college, and many, and I don't want to say most, and be provocative, but many came out without actually knowing a hell of a lot about it, much of anything. But let's frame that as something that is, it's not exactly obsolete. And in my business, I value a broad education and a broad understanding of the world, history and political science, philosophy, religion, culture, et cetera. But what's happened over a long period of time is that now there is a mismatch, and I agree with David in the way he framed mismatch, in a broader sense. There needs to be a sort of a cultural shift. There are too many people coming out of college, not just indebted, which did not happen in the time when I was going to school. Student loans were very kind of rare, as I recall. I was kind of shocked to see $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion of student loans, many of which had to be written off. But what needs to be done is a cultural shift as well as an educational shift, meaning that engineering, tech, mechanical, practical jobs that are so desired by so many employers that can't find people to fill jobs of all kinds, in the energy patch, in your area, lots of things. They are culturally, they're not exactly trafe, meaning non-kosher, but they're considered to be a lower form of education, and that's wrong. And there are a lot of ways to earn lots more money and have a tremendous amount of respect and need by society than being an English major or studying poetry. I love poetry, but what needs to be done, and I'm not commenting on the government action versus non-government action, but the need of society, American society, among other things, is to create dignity in that work and to really be very, very responsive to the needs of employers, and I think that's an important part of the kind of societal edginess that has in America and through much of the developed world created political resentments, and political resentments result not only in fringe political parties and fringe movements, but in policies that are oriented towards groveling to the latest whims of people that in many cases are justifiably resentful of the imbalance of in particular the economic recovery of the last 8 years.
You mean populism?
Yes. I get paid by the word.
I get paid to turn long prose into short headlines.
We ought to get together.
Okay.
I want to, as promised, open up to our audience, questions from the audience. Maybe we'll take one from right here. If you could stand, and we'll bring a microphone to you. And I was at a panel the other day, and I was accused of missing my right side, so I promised to come over here next.
I'd like to ask Paul Singer what he thinks is the answer to the structural economic problems that existed according to what he diagnosed since 2000 or even before, and continuing and were masked by the financial crisis. So what do we do now with respect to those financial problems that were created and continued?
I mean, it's potentially a very long answer, but I'll give bullet points or headlines.
Or Gillian can help you. You give the long version.
I wouldn't dare to try and summarize the Republican Party platform anyway, or the future Republican Party platform.
Neither of mine. There are many elements. I think the policies of the last 8 years have contained a lot of growth suppression. So tax reform, tax cuts, incentives. I believe in incentives and disincentives. Tax, regulatory reform. I believe the healthcare law in the last 8 years has been growth suppressive and needs a bunch of fixes. And I think that these labor market reforms, which should include, there are programs, but they're small. They're not as responsive and fast and creative as they could be. Programs to train, retrain, enable people easily to move geographically to where jobs actually are. I think the financial system, which was unsound in 2008, is still unsound. Less unsound, but still unsound, is still unsafe. And so there are financial market reforms, which I believe Dodd-Frank, the big reform of the last 8 years, needs to be repealed, fixed, whatever. And I think that a solid financial system is the plumbing of the global economy and the American economy, and could generate fixes. The last headline point I would mention in this regard is monetary policy. I believe that in the last 8 years, the people, Congress, the president, have relied upon monetary policy to give them an excuse not to make the hard structural reforms to generate more growth and a more balanced recovery. And so what you have is that investors, people that own high-end real estate, art, rich people, have done fantastically, many of the people in this room. And the middle class has been struggling with underemployment, unemployment, the things we've been talking about in the last few minutes. I call that a distorted recovery, and it's part of, first of all, it's led to resentment, which has bled into all these other forces of populism. So I think there's a number of these policy areas which can and should be addressed to generate I can't think of an alternative word than happier, but freer, happier, more rapidly growing, comfortable society where people are comfortable in the dignity of work and their career paths and life paths.
So before I go to the question over here, Gillian, David, is there anything you'd add or subtract from Paul's list?
I would just add in incentives. You can use the tax system to incentivize investment more. There needs to be more investment, and to incentivize training.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think all I'd observe is I think most of what Paul talked about was reducing the role of government in order to free up private sector investment and job growth. And I think that's the kind of frame that I bring to that as somebody in an operating business that is investing or trying to invest a lot of capital and employing a lot of people. So I think philosophically I agree with that. And I mean, it is interesting, I totally agree that I think Dodd-Frank is another one of those masking events people see it and they think, oh, the financial system is now stable and secure. It's not stable and secure. It's maybe more stable and secure, but it's also grossly more regulated. And on balance, I don't think if you look at economic growth, having a more secure financial system that is over-regulated, with the regulations getting in the way of common sense things that financial institutions would like to do, like lending money to small businesses, just to take an example, I don't think that is the ultimate right solution for economic growth. Not saying repeal Dodd-Frank, I don't think, Paul, you are either, and replace it with nothing. I'm saying there is a more rational regulatory scheme you can have that will maximize protections, but will also maximize incentives to invest and to operate financial institution businesses free of government interference.
Let me go. We've got a question over here.
Hi, this has been great. I think this is one of the most honest economic discussions I've seen in 10 years. And I just have a question about where we go from here. We've tripled the national debt in the last 12 years. We haven't had an economy that's grown between 0 and 1.5%. In 1983, the U.S. economy grew at 7.5% for the next 10 years, largely above 3% a year. We're $20 trillion in debt today. What are the three things, if you could advise congressional leadership today, what are the three things that you would recommend to try to return us to something that looks like a more normal growth and economic opportunity path in America?
Getting a president who's focused on economic policy might be a good start.
So
Implementing, because, the tragedy of, and I say that, I don't mean to be sarcastic here, but the tragedy of what's going on right now is that many of the people who voted in the current administration did so hoping that there would be deregulation, that there would be sensible tax reform, maybe some infrastructure investment, et cetera, focus on jobs and training. And there are people around Washington today who understand what needs to be done. Some have the business experience to actually formulate plans, and if they were given freedom, enough experience of doing strategic planning and stuff to actually implement some sensible ideas. As we've seen so far in the last 5-6 months, there's such a level of distraction today that it seems increasingly unlikely that that sensible, proactive approach, won't materialize.
So I think there's an amazingly short and simple answer to your question, but in my practical bent, I will admit it isn't happening. So there's a 2-word answer to your question. SimpsonBowles. Rational plan, 5 parts, all accomplishable by a centralized government. There isn't a single person who I've talked to in Washington who won't privately say, and many of them publicly say, this is what we need to do to be able to attack these problems. And yet there's not a single person who is prepared to actually stand up and say, we're going to do it. Because all of the things in SimpsonBowles, logical, they are all politically difficult, incredibly politically difficult, particularly coming to grips with entitlement. So Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, 60% of our budget today, of the federal budget today, 60% in those 3 buckets. So that's my simple answer. SimpsonBowles. We could figure out a way to get some momentum behind those reforms. The litany that you reeled off would be resolved within our lifetime.
Paul, I know you want to...
Yeah, I believe in giving the customer what he or she wants. So you asked for 3, I'm going to give you 3.
I did 2. I thought that was pretty good. SimpsonBowles. I wanted 3.
Before I do, I'd like to say that I'm optimistic in the sense that although the political environment is obviously incredibly complicated and polarized beyond anything that anyone remembers, I'm optimistic that there are things that can be done, and it's possible that they will actually get done. And what are 3 that I think would be transformational if they get done? One is entitlement reform. I think I said a few minutes ago that the entire developed world is insolvent because of the entitlements. If I didn't say it, It's true, the long-term entitlement programs. And some economists think that that's not the effective equivalent of debt. I believe it is, because it could be repealed. I believe it is presently the effective equivalent of debt because no developed country has made the slightest change in their long-term entitlement programs. In fact, they are growing. The promises are growing. And so entitlement reform with this $100 trillion present value of deficit in the developed world would not only be something that moves toward solvency, of which the, did you mention $20 trillion of debt? If you did, that's the amount of stated literal bonds and other debt in the United States alone. Entitlement reform would be a signal that politicians, leaders are capable of large projects, large improvements, leadership, strong leadership. There's been none in the last 30 or 40 years in this regard in the entire developed world. Number two, tax reform. Incentives. The world, globalization is here to stay. Globalization meaning products, services coming from almost everywhere on the globe. It's unstoppable, and business people, you can trap a factory, you can trap a plant by horrible policies. You can tell somebody in Venezuela that they'll go to jail if they shut down the company. But basically, capital will go where it's welcome and where it's subject to understandable, fair rule of law, culture, tax, regulatory, accounting standards, et cetera. And so tax is part of it, and tax, there's a signaling effect of saying millionaires and billionaires aren't paying their fair share, and we're going to raise this tax and that tax, the other tax. A business person extrapolates. Well, this is not such a friendly place or environment or time to expand, and it's part of the equation of slow growth. And that goes for a lot of different kinds of taxes. Regulatory reform. Many business people say that it's not the taxes, that the biggest challenge and the biggest headache is regulation, not just regulation in general, but unaccountable, ever-expanding, ununderstandable, vague legislation as regulation as legislation. In other words, regulators really legislating from their desk, from their whim. And so I think these three things would both really possibly be electrifying in showing business, and others, of course, but other kinds of reforms too, would actually turn things. And failure reinforces failure, and success and a positive energy and positive tone, positive policies reinforce positive and potentially growing growth and employment opportunity.
We've got a question here, and then I promise I'll go to this side of the room. Lady in the back.
Yes, it sounds like the doctors have the prescription for the cure, but we don't have the delivery mechanism. And the question is, how do we make these changes, and is there a way to use technology to do it?
Go for it.
Wouldn't you?
I am the eternal optimist. I'm a believer in government. I actually have seen good government work. I've also seen a lot of bad government not work. And so I don't want to depress anyone, but I actually think it's more than a delivery system flaw here. I mean, there is a courage gap in too many of our elected officials, and there's not enough premium being paid by the electorate on making difficult decisions that may be unpopular or can be ginned up as being unpopular. And so my answer to the question really is that things aren't bad enough yet. We're going to need a worse crisis. We're going to need worse than 2%, 2.25% economic growth. We're going to need 1.25%, 1%. We're going to need unemployment rates, real unemployment rates at a much higher level, and in order to develop a national consensus that we have a crisis here, and not just a blip, a slow recovery, some of the things that you hear people say. I think that's the only thing that is going to motivate the kind of action that Paul talked about, which, by the way, those are 3 of the 5 elements of Erskine-Bowles. So it's, I mean, those are the things that need to be done. I just don't know that we have the, particularly for entitlement reform. The other 2, there may be the courage to do something. But I think things are going to need to get worse before that happens.
Gillian and then Paul.
Well, you don't
and I'm hoping it'll be a little more optimistic than what David said.
You don't often get a senior business executive hoping for a big recession. That's quite
Not exactly hoping for it, but I don't know what else we're going to get.
Well, that's another sign of the topsy-turvy world we live in. But I'm going to try and inject one tiny note of optimism, because if you go to the federal government these days in Washington, I tend to emerge feeling like I want to jump off the nearest tall building. But a little known detail to think about. If you go to the Treasury building these days, there's a statue outside it. And it's not a statue of Hamilton. It's a statue of a man that probably most of you haven't ever thought much about, called Gallatin, who was a Swiss man who was very important in the whole development of American history. And that Swiss connection is very important because one of the reasons why the US has the federal structure is because people borrowed from Switzerland and Switzerland's federal structure and approach to government. And Switzerland's a country that works pretty well because it knows the value of having local government where citizens are directly connected to the people who are actually spending money, and where there's a sense of community and there's a sense of local experimentation and diversity. And one of the things that makes me optimistic about America is the fact that the federal structure here has created 1,000 tiny test tube experimentation labs across America, where local governments and states can actually try and do things a bit differently. Doesn't always give them a lot of freedom to act, but when I want to feel optimistic about America today, I find that actually looking away from the federal government and all the problems there and the lack of bipartisan, proactive, sensible action, and looking to some of the local towns and cities and states which are trying to do sensible, proactive planning is often a lot more cheering and encouraging. And I won't go through all the examples that I'm encouraged by, but probably many of you know them. There are disaster cases too, but the important thing is there's experimentation and the ability to experiment.
With Paul.
Yeah, I want to express a strong disagreement with one part of what David said previously. That we may need or require a crisis or a sharp fall off of growth in order to make the necessary reforms. I'm very, very concerned, and I hear that in my community, political community, policy community, trading community. I hear that, and sometimes from different kinds of people across the spectrum. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. I think what we need is to get growth up and to get it up right now. Because what we have is 8 years of subpar growth, $15 trillion of, no, it's about 18 right now, of debt, newly created, newly printed debt on the books of the major developed countries' central banks, money printing for the last 8 years, holding up the economies, no recession for the last 8 years, and basically 0% or close to 0% interest rates. Interest rates in America have just gotten up to the level that created the crazy structured products, real estate, subprime mortgage boom that led to the crash. Interest rates, policy rates in Europe are below 0. In Japan, they're below 0. The UK, it's a little bit above 0. This is nuts. It has held up the global economy in an artificial way, created the distortions. But the reason I give that framework is because if we get into a recession now, what are these central banks going to do for an encore? Look what this last 8 years has done in terms of the inklings of political, they are just inklings. You think you've seen political fringe movements and fringe characters. You ain't seen nothing yet. And what would possibly, and I believe probably, boost that fragmentation, extremism, you know, that rheostat, that dial sharply into the red zone is another recession right now. So I think growth, I think policymakers, and I'm optimistic in the sense that policymakers could be better than they are doing around the world. Maybe they won't be. There's no sign right now that they will take the hard choices. But if they don't, and if there's a new recession or financial crisis, which I think is eminently possible, it won't be a trigger to effective action. It probably will be a really bad thing.
So Paul,
Just to be clear, I mean, I'm not rooting for a recession or for a downturn. I was responding to a question. I actually like Gillian's answer better than mine. So just so you know, my most extended political and government service was in local government when I was Ed Rendell's chief of staff in Philadelphia. So I'm a huge fan of mayors. I also got Ed elected governor in Pennsylvania, and I'm a secondarily huge fan of governors. I think what Gillian says is absolutely right. So last weekend, as Aspen was starting, I got to spend 3 days with 800 mayors at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Miami, which is the exact opposite of the weather that we're having in Aspen, for the record. And my optimism about the future is normally rooted in the creativity and innovation that comes from our cities and our states. And I've said publicly before that if you look back on 30 years and look at every innovative idea that's worked in government, it's come from the cities or the states. Yep. They are the laboratories of this. And I actually triggered from the time I spent in Miami, I actually think that mayors might really, to go back to the original question, mayors might be a political force to help focus the federal government on what it is that needs to be done, maybe armed with Paul's accurate fear of what a recession or a crisis would create, and that use mayors with their better connectivity to real voters and to grassroots, and their creativity and ideas and political capacity. Maybe they're the ones who create the pressure to make the change that needs to be made.
I mean, frankly, I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the things that's very interesting right now is not just to ask the question, why is it when you have a lot of bright, pragmatic, imaginative people working at the local level, we have a federal system that is so absolutely mired in disaster much of the time? You know, why can't we have trickle up political lessons, trickle up political energy rather than trickle down? And one really interesting thing right now is that if you look at the current climate change debate, whichever position you take on it, the reaction of the mayors to pulling out of the Paris Accord and the degree of networks that are being created and the degree to which mayors of different political flavors are willing to work with each other, swap ideas, and actually get pragmatic and bipartisan, I think is fascinating. So let's hope that actually the counterpoint to looking at Washington and feeling depressed is looking at the grassroots and feeling a little chink of optimism. Heavens only knows we need it.
Are you saying kumbaya?
No, for once in my life, although as a journalist I'm paid to be cynical most of the time, for once in life I'm trying to be more optimistic than a hedge fund manager.
I'm going to go to a question in the back over here.
Great, thank you. Question for Mr. Singer.
Would you mind speaking up a tiny bit?
Sure. Question for Mr. Singer. We've talked a lot about taxes and governmental policies today, but if we're going to make the economy great again, the conventional wisdom among many people today is Amazon is destroying retail, Tesla and Uber will destroy the legacy automotive companies. Where do you sit on that? Do you think do you agree with that these disruptive companies, often winner take all, winner take most, are going to just continue? Or do you think we're going to see some sort of return to companies that have legacy positions? Thank you.
I'm really glad you asked that question because it is really one of the central, it contains one of the central issues of the global economy going forward. And that is, here you have technologies and companies that are not just disruptive, but they are gobbling up seemingly without limit, without prospective limit, gobbling up everything. What I would say about it is I am a former lawyer, but I'm not going to pretend to be an antitrust lawyer. But my impression and my understanding and my belief is that this is exactly why the antitrust laws exist. The antitrust laws are having a hard time coming to grips with this because technology is so cool and Facebook is so cool and everything's so cool. But they are, I mean, go back and look at Standard Oil of New Jersey, what they did, what they created, and look at what's happening now, and you say, my God, some combination of action, uncompetitive actions, and results contain the seeds of some kind of massive, massive pushback against control by 4 or 5 or 10 companies. So you will see that. There's no question you will see that, among other reasons, because much of the rest of the economic system will rise up. It's a pathogen in a metaphorical sense in the American and global financial system. There will be pushback, there will be struggle, and there will be resolution within the antitrust and other laws. I saw an article about the FDA, the FTC will get involved. So I think that's a great question and an important path of public policy in the next few years.
I think we've got time for one more question from the front, and I'll ask our mic runners to come up from here. And I apologize, all of us will be available in some form. I think Gillian's on 3 other panels today, so there'll be a chance to ask questions afterwards.
Given the fact that entitlements, as you mentioned, are 60% of the government spending, what do you think about replacing them with a universal basic income? And speaking of experiments, there is an experiment going on right now in Oakland, California by Y Combinator that is trying to test out a program of a basic income guarantee.
That's a good one to close on. Perspectives on universal basic income?
So I don't know that
And maybe not everybody in the audience knows what we mean. We said take a second, David, and define it.
So, but basically, with a universal basic income, you have a governmentally subsidized, governmentally provided income level for everyone that would permit them, for example, to be able to pay for their own health care in the market, provide for their own retirement, et cetera, and whether that is a more efficient delivery mechanism than what we currently have under Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That'd be my simple definition of it. So I clearly don't know enough. I haven't seen enough work on it. I have no idea how the math of that would work and whether, in fact, we'd end up spending 60% or 50% or 70% of the budget to be able to provide that and to be able to do that. So I think I've heard about the Northern California pilot. I think it'll be very interesting to see in a couple of places how that works and what the price tag is. But I'm inherently suspicious that type of a reform mechanism is actually going to solve the problem and create less of a problem by having an even larger governmental program, even if it's in a different, if it's in a different form than the existing entitlement programs.
Paul, some closing thoughts?
Sure. I think universal basic income, is that what it's called? Yeah. I think it goes in exactly the wrong direction. I think society has a hard time, as demonstrated by a variety of welfare programs, welfare reform. Society has a hard time distinguishing, calibrating in basically a political process, calibrating between what is really requiring compassion, people who are in real need, and creating the wrong incentives. There's just incentives to not work. We want the incentive set. We want to take care of people who really need it. I think that's basically universally agreed. But incentive sets that incent dignity, the dignity of work, good work, better, more people working for longer. I'm in favor of the expansion of the retirement age. The retirement age is created by two things: political pressure in cities and mayors giving away, 20 and 30 years and out and full pensions. Entitlements are created by political pressure, not by a careful calibration of needs. So I think universal basic income it's not only that it would cost too much, it's that it goes in the wrong direction in my view.
Gillian, and then I'll.
Briefly, I actually am quite in favor of some element of universal basic services rather than income, although I can see problems with the issue of incentives. But to me, the bigger question is this: if we're moving into a world of growing digitization, where essentially a small slice of the population are taking more and more of the fruits of this productivity, or this technological revolution, if we're moving to towards a world where the economy can keep growing, but we don't necessarily need as many people in the workforce or earning as good a wage, there is a really big question about how a welfare state or how the social contract is going to look going forward. Every time there's been a big technological change in the last 300-400 years, be that the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, or the post-World War II corporate revolution, essentially you've had to rewrite the fundamental social contract and, if you like, the welfare state. And something like that is going to have to happen in America, not just to ensure that growth is great again, but also ensure that there is what Paul calls a more comfortable, happy society. There's a desperate need to have that debate about how that social contract is going to be, and sadly, that hasn't happened yet. It needs to happen.
Yeah, well, and I think it needs to happen before we hit David's version of the burning platform here. So let me close on that note of optimism. Thank you very much for coming out early in the morning.